There's a kind of peace you can only find in the early hours of the morning. The kind where the world feels like it's frozen in time, untouched by the chaos of the day. I used to love walking through the quiet streets of my neighborhood after midnight, letting the cool air settle over me like a blanket. It was my time to clear my head. But this one night, I realized that peace sometimes comes with a price. I was 26 that summer, staying in a small coastal town. I'd taken some time off work, hoping to recharge. I had rented a little apartment just off the main strip, not far from the beach. The town was usually crowded during the day, tourists coming in and out, snapping pictures and leaving behind a mess of litter and noise. But by midnight, it was empty, the kind of empty that felt unnatural. That night, I had been sitting in the apartment, staring at the walls, unable to sleep. Something had been eating at me. Work, family, life. It all seemed to be crashing together in one overwhelming mess. I needed to clear my head, so I decided to take a walk, maybe down to the beach, or even just to the boardwalk. I didn't care. It was already past 2 a.m. when I stepped outside. The air was thick and heavy, like a storm was coming. But the streets were silent, and there wasn't a soul in sight. Not a single car, not a single person. It was the kind of silence that makes you wonder if something's wrong. I made my way toward the boardwalk. It was a place I used to love during the day. The shops, the arcades, the sounds of people laughing and talking. But now, in the dead of night, it felt like a ghost town. The lights were dim, casting long shadows across the empty street. The air smelled like salt and old wood. As I walked further down, the quiet was almost oppressive. The boards beneath my feet creaked with every step, and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind only made the silence feel deeper. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I didn't expect to feel watched. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe a shadow or a figment of my imagination. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I stopped, hoping it was just another late-night walker, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I kept walking, my heart starting to beat a little faster, but still, there was no one. Just the sound of my shoes hitting the wooden planks. But then I heard them again. This time, they were louder, closer, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was still no one. I quickened my pace, hoping it was all in my head, but the footsteps kept pace with me, never too far behind. I wasn't alone. I started to panic. My feet stumbled, and my breath came quicker. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that it was just a late-night jogger or someone else out for a walk. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I turned around again. This time, the person was there, standing at the far end of the boardwalk, just standing still, staring at me. A figure dressed in dark clothing, hooded, their face hidden in shadow. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of them, tall and still. I felt my pulse race, and my legs suddenly felt weak. I wasn't sure what to do, so I just kept walking, hoping they'd stay behind. But with every step I took, the figure seemed to move closer, without taking a single step. I turned again, and they were closer. A chill ran down my spine, and I broke into a jog, not daring to look back anymore. I heard them, the unmistakable sound of footsteps slapping the wood behind me, growing louder with every second. I didn't dare stop, my heart hammering in my chest as I sprinted down the empty boardwalk. I wasn't going to stop until I reached the end. The boardwalk seemed longer than it ever had before. Each step, each breath, felt like it would be my last. I could hear them gaining on me, each step matching mine. Closer, closer. I could almost feel their breath on my neck. I reached the end of the boardwalk. My car was parked just a few yards away, but it felt like it was miles. I could hear the footsteps right behind me, now just a few steps away. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely press the unlock button. The car beeped, and I threw open the door, almost falling inside. I slammed it shut, locked the doors, and turned the key in the ignition. I hit the gas and whipped the wheel, heading toward the exit. I didn't dare look back, but just as I passed the place where I'd parked, I caught a glimpse of him. The figure, standing in front of my car, right where I had just been. But this time, I could see more. The hood was up, and the face was blurry, like I couldn't focus on it. I didn't stop to figure it out. I just drove, my heart pounding in my throat, until I was far enough away that I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. The whole way home, I didn't care about the road, the speed limits, or anything. I just wanted to get back to the safety of my apartment. I didn't look back, not once. When I finally pulled into the driveway and rushed inside, I locked every door, every window. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of the figure kept replaying in my mind. The way they stood there, unmoving, their eyes hidden in the darkness. The next day, I thought it would all feel like a bad dream. But it didn't. I went to the police, told them everything. They checked the boardwalk, but there was no sign of anyone. No cameras, no witnesses. The boardwalk was empty, just like it always was at that hour. They asked if I had been drinking, or if maybe I had imagined it. I told them I hadn't, but they didn't seem to believe me. They said to call if I saw anything unusual again, but I didn't. I never went back to that boardwalk. I left the town a few days later, and the memory of that figure faded into the back of my mind. But even now, sometimes when I'm walking alone at night, I can still feel it. The sensation of being watched. Of something. Or someone. Just out of sight. Waiting. Maybe I imagined it. Or maybe it's still out there. Watching. This happened when I was about 12, a little older than some of the other kids in my neighborhood, but still young enough to get into mischief. It was a summer evening, right around dusk, and I was hanging out with my best friend, Jason. We'd been riding our bikes all day, just doing what kids do, running around, causing trouble, and laughing at stupid jokes. But that evening was different. You see, we lived in a small town with a really old park right at the edge of the woods. It wasn't the most exciting place, but it was where we spent most of our time, just goofing off. There was this one part of the park, though, that we always stayed away from, the old swing set. They had these metal swing chains that screeched when the wind blew, and the swings themselves always moved, even when there was no breeze. It was kind of creepy, but we didn't think much of it, until that night. Jason and I were riding our bikes down the road, taking the long way home. We passed the park, and for some reason, I suggested we go check it out. He wasn't too keen on the idea, but I pushed him. You know how it is when you're a kid. You get a little bored, and you start thinking maybe you can handle things that scare you. We rode up to the park, and everything seemed quiet. There were no other kids, and the usual sounds of laughter and chatter were missing. The air felt still, heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. The only noise was that familiar creak of the swings as they moved in the wind. Even though there was no wind, Jason was already getting weirded out. He kept glancing over his shoulder, and I could see that he was trying to avoid looking at the swings. But me? I couldn't stop staring at them. They were swaying back and forth, but it wasn't like a gentle swing. It was like someone was actually sitting on them, pushing them higher than they should have been, almost as if they were being ridden by someone invisible. I dared Jason to go closer, but he wouldn't. He said he didn't want to get involved in whatever was going on. But the curiosity was getting to me. I just had to know what was going on. I left my bike at the edge of the park and walked toward the swings. As I got closer, the air around me seemed to get colder, like the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. I hesitated for a second, but the mystery of it was pulling me in. I was just a kid, so I didn't think twice about what could happen. I reached out for one of the swings, the metal cold under my fingers. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, like someone was talking just behind me. I whipped around, but there was no one there. I wasn't sure what to think. I figured it was just my imagination, but the voice sounded so real. I shook it off, thinking maybe it was the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. I took a seat on one of the swings, and immediately, the feeling of being watched hit me. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. Something was off about this place. I kicked my feet into the dirt to start swinging, and that's when I saw it. Just past the swings, in the shadows of the trees, I saw movement. A figure standing still but watching me. It was hard to make out the details, but there was something about the way it was standing that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a person. It felt wrong. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just another kid from the neighborhood. But then, the voice came again. Louder this time. "Don't leave yet," it whispered. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around slowly, and I saw the figure moving closer. That's when the scream hit me, the high-pitched, sharp sound that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing right at the edge of the swings, only a few feet away from me, its face pale and twisted, its eyes wide open but lifeless. I stood up so fast that I almost tripped. I couldn't breathe. My whole body was frozen with fear. The figure didn't move, just stood there staring at me, its hands hanging limply by its sides. And then, the worst part, the voice came again, this time much clearer. "Come here!" My legs finally started working again, and I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my heart in my throat. I could hear the whispers behind me, getting louder as I ran, almost like they were chasing me. I didn't stop until I reached Jason, who was still by our bikes, looking confused. I was out of breath, and I couldn't form the words to explain what had just happened. We left the park immediately, without looking back. I didn't go back there for years, not until I was older and had a different perspective. Even then, the memory of the face, the twisted, lifeless face, haunted me for a long time. I never told anyone what happened that night. I didn't even tell Jason. It was one of those things I couldn't explain, and honestly, I didn't want to. Sometimes, though, when I drive by that park now, I can't help but glance over. I swear, sometimes I see a shadow in the distance, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. Maybe it's just me, but I'll never forget that night. I never thought much about the shortcut behind my neighborhood. It was just a narrow footpath that cut through a patch of woods, leading to the main road. I'd taken it 100 times before, usually during the day, but one night I made the mistake of using it after dark. I was 16, coming home from a friend's house a little later than I should have. My parents were strict about curfew, and I figured cutting through the woods would save me at least 10 minutes. The main roads had streetlights and sidewalks, but this path was just dirt and leaves, swallowed by trees. I hesitated briefly at the entrance, but told myself it was fine. I had my phone, and besides, it was just a path. What could happen? The first few steps in, everything seemed normal. The moonlight filtered through the branches, and I could hear the distant hum of traffic beyond the trees. But as I got deeper in, the path seemed different. The air felt colder, and the usual sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, were gone. It was silent, completely, unnaturally silent. I picked up my pace, trying not to let my mind wander. Then I heard something. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I stopped walking, and so did the sound. I turned, shining my phone's flashlight behind me, but the path was empty. Just trees and darkness. I swallowed hard and kept moving, forcing myself not to look back. Then the footsteps started again. They weren't loud, but they matched my rhythm exactly, step for step, like someone was trying to mimic me. My chest tightened. I picked up my speed, walking faster than before, but the steps behind me did the same. I broke into a jog. So did they. And then, when I finally pushed myself into a full sprint, I heard it. A low, rasping breath right behind me. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't waste the breath. I could see the street lights ahead. Just a few more seconds and I'd be out of the trees. Something moved in my peripheral vision. Something tall, lurking just beyond the trees. I didn't dare turn my head to see. My only focus was getting out. I burst onto the sidewalk, nearly collapsing as I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the trees. Nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. Just the empty, quiet path stretching back into the dark. I stood there, panting, trying to convince myself it had been my imagination. But then I saw it. On the ground, right where I had stepped onto the sidewalk, lay something that hadn't been there before. A single, dirty shoe. A shoe that wasn't mine. I stared at it, my mind racing. Was it just a coincidence? Maybe someone had lost it earlier in the day? Maybe I hadn't noticed it when I first walked onto the path, but deep down, I knew better. I took a shaky breath and reached down to pick it up, turning it over in my hands. The sole was damp, coated in fresh mud, mud that hadn't dried yet. Someone had left it there recently. I dropped it instantly, backing away. My house was only a couple blocks away, but every shadow along the sidewalk felt deeper, more menacing. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and checked the time. Just a little past midnight. My parents were asleep. I crept upstairs, feeling ridiculous for being so shaken, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I swore I could hear those footsteps echoing in my head. The next morning, curiosity got the best of me. I had to know if the shoe was still there. I walked back to the entrance of the path, my heart pounding. The shoe was gone. A strange mix of relief and unease settled over me. Maybe an animal had dragged it away. Maybe someone else had found it and picked it up. But then I noticed something even more disturbing. New footprints in the mud. Fresh ones, leading out of the woods. And they weren't mine. I followed them with my eyes, watching as they trailed onto the sidewalk, leading straight to my house. A chill ran through me. I turned around and walked away, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But that night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, not outside, not on the path, inside my house. I sat up, holding my breath. My door was closed, but I could hear slow, deliberate steps in the hallway. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the crack under my door. A shadow passed by. I wanted to scream, but fear held me frozen. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then the doorknob turned. I leapt out of bed, slamming my weight against the door before it could open. "Mom! Dad!" I yelled, pounding on the wood. I heard a sudden shuffle on the other side, like someone retreating down the hall. A few seconds later, my parents' bedroom door swung open, and my dad's voice boomed. "What's going on?" I fumbled to turn on my light, my breath coming in panicked gasps. My dad stormed into the hall, my mom close behind him, but there was no one there. The front door was locked, the windows were shut, no signs of a break-in. I told them everything, from the shortcut to the shoe to the footsteps outside my door. My dad checked every room, but the house was empty. "You probably had a nightmare," he said. My mom gave me a worried look, but didn't argue. Maybe they didn't want to believe it.